Dan Bongino approaches homeless veteran woman. What he does next shocks everyone. She sat on the cold sidewalk, shivering, wrapped in a thin, tattered blanket. Her hands, rough and calloused, clutched a cardboard sign with shaky writing. U.S. Army veteran hungry. Anything helps. People passed by, some glancing at her, most pretending not to see. She was used to it. Invisible, forgotten, just another homeless vet. Then, a black SUV rolled up to the curb. The door opened and a man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, sharp eyes scanning the street. It was Dan Bongino, former Secret Service agent, political commentator, and a man known for speaking his mind. He looked down at the woman, then knelt beside her. His voice was steady. "What's your name, ma'am?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Lisa." Dan nodded, then did something no one expected. What he did next would leave everyone speechless. Lisa avoided eye contact, her fingers tightening around the edges of her sign. She had learned that when someone stopped, it was usually to lecture her, judge her, or make promises that never came true. Dan didn't speak right away. He just sat there, kneeling on the dirty sidewalk beside her. The busy street moved around them, horns honking, people talking, life going on like she wasn't there. Then, he asked again, softer this time. "Lisa, how long have you been out here?" She swallowed hard. 3 years. Dan exhaled, his jaw tightening. 3 years of sleeping on concrete, of feeling like the world had thrown her away. Lisa used to be someone. She had served her country. She had worn a uniform with pride. But after coming home, things had fallen apart. PTSD, medical bills, job losses, one bad break after another, until there was nothing left but the streets. She had tried to get help. The VA waitlists were long, shelters were full. People saw a homeless woman, not a veteran, not a human being. Dan's voice broke through her thoughts. "You hungry?" Lisa nodded. Without another word, Dan stood up, held out a hand, and said something no one expected. "Come on, you're eating with me." Lisa hesitated. Most people wouldn't even look at her. And now this man, this famous man, was asking her to have a meal with him. The crowd around them had started to take notice. Phones were coming out, cameras rolling. People were watching now, but Dan didn't care. Lisa had no idea her life was about to change forever. Lisa followed Dan into a nearby diner, her steps slow, uncertain. She had been turned away from places like this before. Owners didn't want their customers uncomfortable. She braced herself for rejection. But the moment they stepped inside, something strange happened. Dan didn't just lead her to a table. He pulled out a chair for her, like she was someone important, like she belonged. The waitress hesitated for a second, then walked over. Dan didn't wait for Lisa to order. He looked her straight in the eye and said, "Get whatever you want." Lisa's hands shook as she reached for the menu. It had been so long since she had choices, real choices. She picked something simple, a hot turkey sandwich with mashed potatoes, comfort food, something that tasted like home. Dan ordered two, then leaned in. "Tell me your story." Lisa studied him, waiting for the catch. The pity, the judgment, but there was none. Just a man who was actually listening. So she told him. She talked about the military, how she had served as a medic, how she had seen things she could never forget, how coming home felt harder than deployment, how her support system had collapsed. She didn't cry. She had run out of tears years ago. Dan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat back, arms crossed, deep in thought. Then he said something that made Lisa's stomach flip. "We're fixing this, today." Lisa blinked. "What?" Dan pulled out his phone and started making calls. He wasn't just offering sympathy, he was taking action. And what happened next would change everything. Lisa sat frozen, her half-eaten sandwich forgotten. Dan was dialing numbers, speaking in a voice that wasn't asking for favors. It was demanding action. His first call, a veteran outreach program. He told them about Lisa, her service, her situation. Then he asked a simple question. "What can we do for her today?" The person on the other end hesitated. Then came an answer Lisa hadn't heard in years. "We can help." Dan wasn't done. He made another call, to a local shelter that worked specifically with veterans. They had a bed open. Tonight, Lisa's hands gripped the edge of the table. Her mind was racing. It couldn't be this easy. Nothing had ever been this easy. Then Dan leaned forward. Lisa, we're getting you off the streets. Right now. Her breath caught in her throat. Dan stood up, pulled out his wallet, and placed a stack of cash on the table. Not just for the meal, enough to cover days of food, clothes, anything she needed. Then he looked at her, dead serious. But this isn't just a handout. This is a start. You served this country. Now, let's get you back on your feet. Lisa didn't know what to say. No one had ever done something like this for her. For the first time in years, she felt seen. She felt human. And the best part, Dan wasn't finished yet. Because as they left the diner, something unexpected happened. People who had ignored Lisa before were suddenly stepping up. A businessman handed her a gift card for groceries. A woman offered her a ride to the shelter. It was like Dan's actions had reminded people that Lisa wasn't just a stranger on the sidewalk. She was a person, a veteran, someone who deserved better. Lisa wiped at her eyes, overwhelmed. Then she turned to Dan and whispered, "Why are you doing this?" Dan smiled. "Because it's the right thing to do." But just when it seemed like this story was wrapping up, something no one expected happened. As Lisa and Dan stepped outside, the cool evening air hit her face. She looked around, still in disbelief. For the first time in years, she wasn't wondering where she'd sleep that night. Then a voice called out, "Lisa." She turned sharply, her heart pounding. A man stood at the edge of the sidewalk, staring at her like he'd seen a ghost. He was in his late 50s, gray at the temples, wearing a jacket with a military patch on the sleeve. His hands trembled. Lisa's breath hitched. She knew that face. Before she could speak, the man took a step closer. His voice cracked. "It's me, Dad." Lisa's world tilted. She had been alone for years. She thought he was gone, had no idea if he was even alive. And now, here he was, standing right in front of her. Dan glanced between them, sensing the weight of the moment. The cameras were still rolling. People were watching. But right now, none of that mattered. Lisa's lips parted, but no words came out. Her father, a man she thought she'd never see again, was standing inches away. And the only question now was, what happens next? Should Lisa forgive her father? What's their story? Comment below, and let us know what you think. And if you want to know what happens next, make sure to subscribe, because this story isn't over.